SOS Cuba, Texas Democrats walk out, and billionaires in space. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is The Square Circle. Hello and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are progressive attorney Georgia Gosley.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be back.
Libertarian Catherine Mangue Ward.
Hi there. Nice to join you.
And conservative writer Dan McLaughlin of National Review.
Glad to be here.
Welcome, everyone. This week, protests broke out in Cuba over the country's economic crisis in response to COVID-19. Here's NBC News coverage.
In Cuba, days of dissent with chants of liberty and freedom sweeping through the streets of Havana and other cities.
The situation is dire in Cuba. I mean, literally, the government is trying to cut off communication from the outside world so people don't see the brutality of the situation.
A generational economic crisis, coupled with record COVID numbers and a lack of vaccine, has fueled demands for ending Cuba's 60-year dictatorship. President Biden's response, one of solidarity, though he steered clear of requests to intervene.
We call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence, their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Dan, what's your opinion on what's happening in Cuba?
Well, it's very unusual in the Cuban context to see protests of this magnitude. We have certainly seen resistance to the Cuban government before, but it normally is not on this scale. And undoubtedly, part of that is because the pandemic has put unusual stress on really every form of government and every economic system. But the underlying grievances here really are with the nature of the Cuban system. The communist dictatorship, the repression of political freedom, the repression of economic freedom. And so, the Cuban people have had enough. The question really going forward is where does it go from here? Because, the granting of some modest and moderate reforms is not usually the way this sort of thing goes. Typically, when people protest this way against tyranny, either you get a repressive backlash from the government or the government falls. And there is often very little middle ground between the two. So it's going to be a very interesting time.
I agree with that. And I think we are now living in a very disruptive time throughout the country, the country and the world. People are fed up. People want to be free. It's just as simple as that. So if you have power, you're trying to grab power and hold on to power in Cuba, in America, anywhere. People are fed up. And what's going to happen? It's going to get worse, probably. I hope not, but people just want to be free.
One thing that occurs to me here is what the U.S. can do. I've been actually a little disappointed in some of the responses here in the U.S., somehow suggesting that what's going on is exclusively about trade policy, or that somehow the unrest in Cuba is entirely due to the U.S. embargo. Now, I want to be really clear. I support lifting the embargo. I think that it is a poisonous policy that has had incredibly negative repercussions for the people of Cuba, but it is a huge mistake and in fact plays into what the Cuban regime wants people to say, to somehow lay this at the door of the United States. The blame rests squarely with a corrupt authoritarian regime which has violated fundamental rights on the Cuban people for decades. And so, at the same time, I would really, really love the U.S. to open our borders. I think that, hearing the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, himself a Cuban immigrant, say that people are not welcome on our shores if they can find their way here is incredibly disappointing to me as a person who really hoped to see Biden open up immigration policy. The Cubans, who want to come here should be free to come here and escape the communist regime that they are suffering under.
It is very disappointing after, throughout the Trump administration, The Trump team tried to get a handle on border security, and clearly they took a very, very hard line in a lot of ways. There was all of this kind of performative outrage from the left at, even the idea that you could keep anybody out of the country who was a refugee. And here you have the Biden administration telling Cubans and Haitians as well that they're not welcome here. And the people who were all up in arms about that seem suddenly very quiet. I do think that there is room for refugee policy. And it seems to me that the people you most want to let into your country as refugees are people who, by their departures, are going to weaken the hold of a tyrannical government on their state.
Do you think there's any hope for change with the tyrannical government?
I think it's very unpredictable. Over and over again, we've seen protests like this against tyrannies, and usually they don't succeed, but sometimes they do, and sometimes shockingly quickly. Because eventually there comes a point when, a government that is a repressive government loses the fear of the public if they're not willing to take kind of the Tiananmen Square approach that the Chinese government took. Right. In the fall of 1989, we saw that one government after another behind the Iron Curtain collapsed because they no longer had the will to do brutality and violence to their people. The Chinese went another way and they survived.
I also think that there's a huge difference going on now, which is that there was a change in Cuba and they liberalized the laws around the private possession of cell phones. And that may not seem like the biggest difference in the world, but what it means is that we have footage. The reason we know these protests are happening is that little gap in the almost total communications blackout that has blanketed Cuba for decades, I think could be really significant. I also, as Dan says, I'm fully aware that not every march in the street yields change. I think here in the United States, we've seen that this year, unfortunately. But I think that if there is anything that's different this time, it's that the world can see and Cubans can communicate with each other just a little bit more than they have been able to in the past.
And I think they're encouraged. I think they're encouraged because they look around the world. They look at the United States and, my God, we're always protesting here in the United States as an African American. If we hadn't been protesting now with Black Lives Matter and everything else, God only knows where we would be. So I hope that the people in Cuba somehow, even though it's a very tight, repressive government, I hope somehow they'll keep protesting because, as I say, I feel it in the world. We're in a disruptive time, and some people who perceive themselves to be in power forever, they're really going to have to step aside.
Yeah, and as Catherine said, the technology is a huge disruptor. We saw that in the Arab Spring. Right. Yes. When Al Jazeera, which is hardly, what you would call a small liberal network, but just beaming that into a lot of Arab homes led to a desire for change and a lot of disruption. We saw that in Iran as well, in that time period. So I think when you open up access to a variety of voices, no matter even what those voices are saying, just seeing that there's something else out there that's different from what the government is telling you is enormously provocative.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how things play out. Also this week, Democrats in Texas walked out of the Capitol in protest over voting legislation. Here's the story from KHOU in Houston.
With a lopsided vote along party lines,
there being 76 ayes and 4 nays, the motion is adopted.
The Texas House voted to try and track down missing Democratic members
for the purpose of securing and maintaining their attendance, under warrant of arrest if necessary.
State Representative Sean Thierry of Houston shared this video shortly after the vote, showing a House official accompanied by a law enforcement officer checking to see if she was there. But Thierry joined more than 50 colleagues in D.C., a trip aimed at preventing a quorum in Austin and prompting action in Washington, but drawing plenty of fire back home.
As soon as they come back in the state of Texas, they will be arrested. They will be cabined inside the Texas Capitol until they get their job done.
Among those praising Democrats today were 2 busloads of mostly union members traveling from Houston to Austin to lobby against the plan to ban 24-hour and drive-through voting and limit voting by mail, which Republicans say will help secure elections.
Georgia, do you think the Democrats did the right thing?
My God, yes. Yes, they did the right thing. What else can they do? I mean, Texas is what, 84% people of color, and you have a handful of Republican men, white men, who want to control and stop people from voting? Where are we living? Is this America or a banana republic?
Dan, what's your opinion?
I mean, I think this is a stunt. Unfortunately, the fleeing the state thing is a stunt that we have seen from both sides. I mean, the Democrats did it in Wisconsin when Scott Walker was governor. The Republicans have been doing it repeatedly in Oregon. Democrats in 2003 tried to hang on to essentially gerrymanders that they'd had since Reconstruction, and Rick Perry cracked down on them and was able to finally redistrict the state. So I think they're misreading both the national and the state mood. They're misreading the national setting because here it is such a core message of the Biden administration and the Democrats on Capitol Hill that you absolutely cannot use the tools of a legislative minority to slow things down. Right? They are screaming and yelling about the filibuster, and here they have a minority of the legislature trying to bring everything to a halt. At the same time, I think they're pushing a narrative about Texas voting laws that might be popular with the national media, but really is not what the majority of the people in Texas want or believe is actually in the laws.
They're really trying to be repressive. They just don't want people of color to vote. And why is that? Because when people of color vote, most of the time they don't vote for Republicans. So the Republicans are doing whatever they can do to chokehold the Black vote. And it's not going to work. Sooner or later, it'll all come to wash, and you'll see.
Georgia, one thing I think you're right about is that this is ultimately partisan gamesmanship. I think that it's hard to know, for me, it's hard to know how much of this is actually about racial animus and how much of this is about point scoring. It's very, very hard to disaggregate. Those things have been horribly combined in various ways for so much of the United States history.
I would gander.
One thing that's interesting is that partisans are not very good at predicting which specific voting reforms are going to be good for them. So, we had this weird thing where Donald Trump was attacking no excuse voting by mail when there's really no evidence that that's going to help Republicans. In Florida, we had, a call for an exception to that limit. And now in Texas, the voting requirements are, this is quite a heated rhetoric around actually some somewhat limited reforms, drive-through voting, 24-hour voting. Now, I think voting should be expansive. I think that actually this is a great example of a right that there's genuinely no harm in opening up voting as much as possible. We don't have a voter fraud problem in this country by and large. And so I think that is also specious.
That's the truth.
What I feel comfortable saying is that this is some partisan garbage, and I do not feel comfortable saying that this is necessarily racist. It certainly could have racist outcomes.
Of course,
but
we
can't see in their hearts.
Well, I understand. I can't see in their hearts either, but I've been African American in this country for many, many years, and I can tell you with all due respect to you, it's racial, dear. It's racial. Because if it wasn't racial, why would they make an effort to chokehold the Black vote? It's obviously racial. This country is racial. This country is their history. It's the same thing with this notion of teaching about slavery in schools. This country's history is racist all the way from slavery. So yes, it's bipartisan, it's partisan, but it's very, very much racial.
Well, in terms of the actual content, I mean, and I agree with Catherine that a lot of the actual provisions of the Texas bill are really quite modest. And a fair amount of it is just rolling back voting rights to 2019, which is not such a long time ago. And in fact, I think the net result of this bill will be to leave voting rights and voting procedures in Texas more open than they were in 2019.
Oh my goodness.
And what's interesting to me though here is the Democrats have taken this view that even the most mild inconvenience added on to any right is atrocious. And I just have to say, I really wish that they would take this view when it comes to the right to earn a living, the right to practice your faith, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to freedom of speech. The idea that in so many different areas, the right to educate your children, the Democrats tell people, well, that complying with enormous and burdensome regulations and restrictions is just the price you pay for living in society. And so it seems to me, I'd love to hear them say, take this attitude that all regulation, all rules are bad in some other areas.
But why would there be a minor inconvenience for voting? That's the heart of our democracy, is the right to express yourself at the voting polls. So why would anybody in this country create inconveniences, not just minor inconvenience, criminal penalties for some of the actions, ordinary actions that people would take to support other people who want to vote? Let's just be honest about it. They're trying to choke off the vote.
I am a non-voter. I nonetheless think that it is incumbent on state legislatures, which are the entity that appropriately oversees elections, that they should make access to the ballot box as easy, as convenient, as widespread as possible. I do think that these laws are pretty transparently designed to favor one party or the other in elections. Democrats are not above this. They do this too. It just so happens that Republicans are having a heyday with it right now. And I wish that everyone would, frankly, just sit down and let people vote.
I mean, the reality is that it is still, even assuming that this law passes, it will still be much easier to vote in Texas than it is here in New York, where I live.
Unbelievable.
It's New York.
Yeah.
Well, you all make a lot of good points. Let's move on to the third topic, which is billionaire Richard Branson becoming a pioneer in space travel. Here's ABC News with that story.
3, 2, 1, release.
Tonight, a moment 17 years in the making.
Ignition. Good rocket motor burn.
Richard Branson, more than 50 miles above the Earth's surface, weightless, becoming the first person to fly to space aboard his own spaceship. At 8:40 this morning, the mothership Eve carrying Virgin Galactic's spaceship Unity to about 50,000 feet, dropping it. The heart-stopping moment Unity's rocket ignites, blasting Branson and 5 others to the edge of space, giving them 4 minutes of weightlessness.
To the next generation of dreamers, if we can do this, just imagine what you can do. Hey.
Catherine, do you think this is a great door opening for new enterprise?
So I will say I am absolutely delighted to see billionaires spending their money going to space. And I am surprised at how upset some people have gotten about this. Now, to be clear, I think that Richard Branson is kind of the P.T. Barnum of space, right? He's mostly a showman. There's a lot of fluff. Actually, what he did this week was not a major technological breakthrough. Elon Musk is definitely leading the field in those advances. We will see next week what Jeff Bezos manages to pull off when he gets on his own rocket and goes to space. But I think there's some weird zero-sum thinking going on. I've seen plenty of tweets, including from sitting members of Congress, suggesting that somehow billionaires' wealth belongs to the people or belongs to, worse, the government, and that they should choose how it's spent. And at the same time, those same people seem completely chill with the existence of NASA. So this is like the contradiction I want to highlight a little bit. The government takes people's money without their consent via taxation and spends it on spaceships, and people are like, yay, we love it. Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos get people's money by selling them stuff they want, and then they spend their own money on spaceships with the explicit goal of eventually selling tickets, letting other people go to space too, right? These are not guys who are like stuffing the rockets full of money and disappearing into the distance like supervillains. They want to sell us tickets to space, just like Jeff Bezos wants to sell us literally everything. And that, I think, is a good thing. It's something we should applaud. And I know that other people might spend $1 billion differently than Jeff Bezos has chosen to do, or than Richard Branson has chosen to do. But I really think that it's wrongheaded to see that money as somehow already belonging to the state or the people. It belongs to these guys.
I agree. Yeah. I think it's super exciting to have the thought of going to space, almost like we fly to California or other places. I mean, how they're entrepreneurs and it's their money. They've got a right to spend it. I mean, I'd like to get a ticket and go myself.
I think it's about $250,000 right now on the Branson one. So
exactly.
I gotta save up a little, but.
But I think you'll have a mass market for this once you get the price point where people can go to space for, it's never going to be the cost of a train ticket, but even when it becomes the cost of a wedding, say, it becomes something that people who are not filthy rich but who have money, have some disposable income can save up for, like the big vacation, right? The trip to Hawaii or whatever. Sorry, Catherine.
No, I was just going to say there is one element of this that does make me somewhat uneasy, and that is, of course, that all of these guys have at some point received government subsidies. And I think that the entanglement with government money, the fact that governments are doing stuff like building spaceports in the hopes that maybe they will attract the industry to their state, I think that could go wrong. And I think we should be vigilant about that because, again, I think there's a big difference between taking people's money for space exploration and letting people spend their own money on it. But, even if these sort of billionaire space nerds are not completely, they don't have completely clean hands, I still think it's an interesting and positive development that it's mostly, a private industry activity rather than the state.
Yeah, and look, I mean, historically, first of all, of course, having them spend their money building things is much better than having it sort of sit there like Scrooge McDuck's vault, right? But historically, rich guys spending their money on crazy things has sometimes led to great developments. I mean, Cornelius Vanderbilt built, I think, the world's largest civilian steamship as a yacht to sail across the ocean, but with his family, and this led to improvements in steamship technology that he used throughout his business and that ended up getting used by the United States Navy and in the Civil War and everything. So those kind of investments do yield some benefit to society. It's not all just making some rich guy feel good.
Well, it's been certainly an interesting next space race that we've got going on versus what happened in the 60s. So we've all got exciting stuff to look forward to. Let's now take some questions from our viewers. So how is the difference between what's happening with Richard Branson and what's happening with NASA going to have negative connotations, or will it?
I mean, I think that NASA right now, and historically, has had incredibly high approval ratings. People love NASA. 80% of people say that they have a positive feeling about NASA. And in fact, Elon Musk understood that NASA was going to be an important customer, not just from a financial perspective, but from a PR perspective. Branson is not going that route. Branson is not going to be flying NASA astronauts anytime soon, as far as I know, unless they want to buy a ticket on their own. And it'll be interesting to see whether that ends up with him facing more regulatory barriers. I can absolutely imagine, and in fact, don't have to imagine, already these private space entrepreneurs have really had to sometimes go to battle with the FAA and other regulators just to try out, sort of test burns, other, test flights. I can imagine, particularly if there's some kind of accident, that, the private space sector and the public sector, especially regulators, could end up at odds. But at least for now, NASA and private space are playing nice.
And Dan, I've got a question for a viewer for you. Do you think what's happening in Texas is going to begin a trend in other states?
Oh, there's no question that it already is on both sides, that Republicans are pushing, revisions to the election laws in a whole bunch of states, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, and that Democrats are pulling out every possible stop to make a theatrical show of resistance. I mean, we saw that in Georgia where they took the All-Star game, the baseball All-Star game, away from Atlanta to the great cost of a lot of Atlanta businesses, and moved it to Denver as a protest. And I'm not sure that really was a great thing for Georgia or for Georgia Democrats for that matter. So it waits to be seen whether the Democrats are going to be able to actually get any kind of political capital out of these kind of stunts.
And our last question is from Kimberly Hughes. If Cuba becomes a democracy but retained its socialist economy, would it still have the same problems it has today? Georgia, would you like to take that?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. Would they have the same problems? It's hard to say whether they would have the same problems. I think any country or any society going through a transition, you're having some who are holding on to the past, some who are eager for the future. So you're going to have a mixed bag either way. But I'd like to see something really good happen in Cuba because the people have. Can you imagine being denied the internet as much as everything we do? Google it. Can you imagine just knowing that it's in the world and you don't have access to it? It's unbelievable.
Okay, and now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who'd like to go first?
Well, it's not unreported, but what I'd like to talk about more than anything else are those hardworking people who are being threatened in Kabul, Afghanistan. I actually am working with someone now trying to get him evacuated out of Afghanistan because he was engaged by the United States for years to build highways. And now he's scrambling for his life. And we're doing everything we can to help this gentleman, but our country is so bureaucratic. These special entry visas, which were enacted specifically to help not only the interpreters in Afghanistan, but other people like this gentleman who built highways for the United States. Now he's running for his life. And we're in America dealing with bureaucracy. Something has to happen. We can't leave these allies behind.
Couldn't agree more. That is such a crucial element of our drawdown from Afghanistan. And I am shocked that it has been neglected by the Biden administration and the sort of associated immigration bureaucracy. There are a lot of people whose lives are in danger because they stuck their necks out for us.
Absolutely.
And we should be able to at least give them a piece of paper that says they can come here and we will figure out the rest later.
Yeah, or take them to Guam, someplace else and process them, but get them out of Afghanistan.
There unfortunately is a long and sad history of people who stuck their necks out to fight for the United States and alongside the United States in many, many different theaters of war and got abandoned, from Iraq to Vietnam to Poland, and knew that this was going to happen.
Well, I won't accept that. I'm not going to say it's going to happen because as long as there is some will, America holds itself out to the world that we're the shining country on the hill, that we stand for democracy. We're the big country in the world. Then we need to do the right thing. We need to do the right thing. And those people put their necks on the line. This guy has 7 kids, a family, and he's being threatened. The Taliban said they're going to cut their heads off. And the United States worked with this guy for 15 years. And now he's running for his life. They could easily evacuate them to Guam and let them stay there until they have a time to get rid of this tremendous backlog in America.
So my underreported news story is much more local, but we just saw Maine become the 4th state in the nation to abolish civil asset forfeiture. That's, of course, the practice where law enforcement can seize your property if they suspect that it's connected with criminal activity, even if the owner has not been convicted of a crime. This was one of the laundry list of reforms that came out this summer as part of the sort of criminal justice reform package, and touted by the Black Lives Matter movement, something that I think is incredibly important. Reason Magazine has been covering the just travesty of civil asset forfeiture for years. And, I've been a little disappointed at the limited reforms that have actually come out of the summer, especially, eliminating or curtailing qualified immunity, which I was very hopeful for. But the fact that at a state by state level, we are making at least this little bit of progress, I think is just a really great optimistic story. Maine also restricted another loophole, which was allowing some states to do civil asset forfeiture de facto, which was a sharing arrangement in which the feds take the money and then share it back to the state, local police departments or state budgets. Absolutely ridiculous. Misaligns incentives in really poisonous ways. And I am just so happy to see Maine doing the right thing.
My underreported story is something that happened right under the nose of the National Press Corps, which is right at the start of Joe Biden's speech on Tuesday, he made a point of thanking and greeting his friend and pal, Al Sharpton. And I have to say, I mean, Sharpton, you know, talk about stepping on your own lines. I mean, Sharpton is the single most toxic figure in American public life. I mean, this is a guy who launched his career by, you know, with false rape allegations that led to a successful defamation suit against him, in which he actually promoted crazy conspiracy theories that like the mafia and the IRA were suppressing the truth. You know, I mean, for Biden to be giving a speech in which he's touting the grave threat of the Capitol riot on January 6th, and at the same time opening up who has incited a rich hit that led to murder, not but twice in his career, is really appalling to me. And you know, it seems to me that the National Press Corps ought to be paying a little bit more attention to who Joe Biden's friends are. You know, Biden had some very bad friends back in the 70s who were very much the opposite of Al Sharpton in some ways, but all too similar in other ways. You know, back when he was palling around with Southern segregationists. And I think that Biden should really get a little more heat for this.
Well, I don't think he should get any heat. And, you know, Dan, quite frankly, when you talk about Al Sharpton, I could tell you many, many stories about many other figures that you would know, we would all recognize, and their terrible histories. I won't even dignify that. But I will say to Reverend Al Sharpton, right on, brother. As long as he is, as people like Al Sharpton are out in the streets, we as African Americans, Dan, are still fighting for the privilege and the rights that you just take for granted. So what I say to Al Sharpton is keep up the good fight, work for Black Lives Matter, and you, Dan, like so many other white Americans, need to look in the mirror and come to grips with the truth about what's going on in this country as it relates to race.
Well, I'll just say that Yankel Rosenbaum and Freddie's Fashion Mart would have a different point of view about Al Sharpton.
I'm pretty sure they would.
Well,
He's a good guy.
Catherine, Dan, and Georgia, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. And that's unfortunately all we have time for. Thank you to our guests, and thank you for listening to The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.